Welcome, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. It's now 11 o'clock, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today for the meet of the BIPOC pipeline. And we are pleased to welcome our presenters, Victoria Fernandez, Acting Executive Director of the Black Institute for Ethical Leadership, Rutgers Business School, and Tyneisha Gibbs, Director of Expanding Learning Opportunities at the New Jersey School Age Care Coalition. And we are glad to start today's session, the meat of the BIPOC pipeline. Take it away,
Thank you, Ms. Diallo. We're just going to give a couple more minutes for our colleagues and peers to enter into the room. Just a couple more moments. And we are going to get started. So excited to be here today.
Thank you so much for everyone who's joining and dropping their info in the chat. I love that we're already sharing contact information, getting that network starting nice and early.
You know what I've always found helpful too during online and networking sessions? Just drop your LinkedIn, especially if people aren't, if you're on the Hoover app, then you could just go to the Hoover app of people's profiles and click their LinkedIn if it's there. But if not, just drop that thing in the chat. All right, so we're going to get started here today. Again, welcome and thank you. Our session this morning is titled The Myth of the BIPOC Pipeline. Your presenters for today are myself, Tyneisha Gibbs. I'm the principal of 144th and Vine LLC, as well as the co-founder of the nonprofit Professionals of Color Collective. And my work wife here, right below me in our Hollywood squares, is Vicky Fernandez. Vicky Fernandez, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the acting executive director for the Rutgers Institute for Ethical Leadership. And I'm also the co-founder with my colleague and work wife here, Tyneisha Gibbs, of the nonprofit Professionals of Color Collective. And I'm a brand new board member for the Institute of Music for Children in Elizabeth, my hometown, the land of the Lenape. Quick visual description: I'm a fat woman with white skin, dark curly hair, a mixed ethnicity, Latina. And today I am wearing a plain Jane black t-shirt dress with a little bit of a messy side braid.
Yes, absolutely. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. And my visual description is that I am a light, fair-skinned Black woman with a curly afro, and I am wearing a green dress with white polka dots. I am also tall and fat. Thank you. All right. So today, our session, we're really going to be talking to you about where we are as a sector, where we can go, and how that all comes into play with the BIPOC pipeline. But before we get into that, just a little bit about the nonprofit Professionals of Color Collective. For those of you who attended our networking session yesterday, thank you. We had quite a time. So the nonprofit Professionals of Color Collective really is culturally competent professional development, as well as capacity building and technical assistance. And we're housed out of the Rutgers Institute for Ethical Leadership and funded by the Geraldine Foundation. We provide self-care and personal and professional development for our members. And we also do networking, relationship building, and social events. So it's not all academics. There's a lot of fun too. Some of our group norms that will be guiding our session today. And these are also norms that we use throughout all of our convenings. What happens here stays here. What is learned here leaves here. So two truths can be held at the same time. You want to make sure that you're respecting each other and each other's lived experiences. You want to share space, you want to take up space, but you want to make sure that you land the plane. And so what I mean by land the plane is sticking your point. You want to assume the positive here. We're all in this together. You want to have patience with the process, the organizers, each other, and with technology. Because as we've seen over the past 2 years, is that although we've increased our use of technology, technology will fail us every time. And lastly, want to make sure that we're focusing on relationship building instead of solicitations. So be intentional about the connections that you make today. So let's talk about the state of the sector. Where are we? So the Center for New Jersey's Nonprofits, they produced a survey in 2019 that really focused on equity and racial disparities. And they talked a lot about just where we are as a sector as it pertains to diversity, specifically in our leadership. And so pulling from that data, 1 out of 5 executives are persons of color. 28% of nonprofit staff identify as BIPOC, and 10% of BIPOC executives, they work for organizations that don't primarily serve communities of color. So what does that mean, right? How does that, why does that even matter? So persons of color are really underrepresented in board and staff leadership positions, especially when compared with the overall makeup of staff in the organizations that were surveyed. So that means that 79% of CEOs or executives in organizations were white. And those white people, they comprise 79% of the chief executives, 71% of deputy directors, and 82% of the chief financial officers. And of those organizations, that means that white CEOs and white executive directors are serving more communities of color as opposed to their Black counterparts.
So you know what the situation is, because obviously you've come here to join us today. What we'd like you to do in the chat, tell us some of the tales, if you will, that you've heard about the BIPOC pipeline. I'd love to see some comments from folks about what they've heard. You don't need to believe they're true. You just need to tell us what you heard.
I'm very interested to see.
Me too. Yvette says, can find them. So, Yvette, is that do you mean can't find that? It doesn't exist. Yeah, same. They aren't out here. Mm-hmm. Hey, Michelle. Exactly. I think that's the biggest one that everyone hears, is that there's not BIPOC people. Well, Tyneisha and I work with the collective. And I can tell you that there's over 800 people that are part of the collective that are BIPOC professionals working in the nonprofit sector. We do exist. The instructions were to drop what tales you've heard about the BIPOC pipeline. Just mention them into the chat. They won't fit in. They don't want to work for us. It is a competitive space and we can't afford them. We want to hire them, but we don't have but they don't have the qualification. So I'm so glad that you're touching on some of the really important ones, that folks want those that come out of it. Okay, people want the folks that come out of the pipeline. These are great. And I think we're going to be touching on most of them today, if not all of them. Ty?
Vicky, Amy had a really great one, and I just want to lift this up. She said, relative to education, they have given us every reason. They seem to be trying, going to conferences, but thinking out of the box lately, they are working on student engagement and creating an internal pipeline. Absolutely. I've seen that at several universities, particularly in our great state of New Jersey. Montclair State University has been very intentional in going to high schools to recruit teachers of color.
Yes, I love seeing those kind of opportunities happening where we're being intentional and creating those pipelines for young people and adults. But I think there's some other things that we could to jump on as well. So I love that the chat is flowing. So keep those coming. We're going to keep the conversation going. Ty, can you advance to the next slide for me, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Before we get into the myths that we're going to go over today, I want to just start by saying this was originally at the end of the presentation to summarize, but I was like, no, we need to tackle this at the beginning. Let's start out with this. There are no magic beans. This is not Jack and the Beanstalk. I am not going to give you a portal where you're going to be able to find all the BIPOC people to hire. That's not really how this works. At the end of the day, instead of magic beans, what we're really talking about more are seeds. Planting seeds, sowing gardens, doing the work. There's a lot that goes into this, and we're all a part of this process. We're all farmers on this field. It's not just up to the BIPOC people to make themselves available to you and all of a sudden you'll be able to hire them. There's a lot more that goes into this pipeline. And so if I had to summarize our presentation in one slide, this is where we're going to start. These are the myths that we're going to dig into a little bit more today. And the first one, there aren't any qualified BIPOC candidates. We post our job listings everywhere. Our office is welcoming of all people. My hands are tied. I'm an ally. I get it. And you'll notice there's a little storybook in the bottom corner, because as we go through these myths, I want you to see if you can figure out what the myths are that we're connecting to, if you can connect the fairy tales, popular fairy tales, to the myths that we're going to be tackling today. So if you figure out what the fairy tale is as I go through these slides and Ty goes through these slides, make sure to just drop it into the chat, okay? Ty? Okay, the first one, there aren't any qualified BIPOC candidates. And this is probably the most tricky fairy tale to get. Ty? The reality is that we need to check opportunities against a lens of access, inclusion, and anti-racism. I can give you a great example of this. A dear friend of mine was just hired at a law firm to increase the diversity of new lawyers joining the firm. Well, the lawyers that the firm hires have to be from a very particular set of schools, and those are Ivy League universities. Well, we're looking at really the tree of the poisonous fruit. In this situation, if the institutions that they're restricted to hiring from already have their own issues of internalized, of structural racism, then how can we possibly expect there to be a vibrant pool to choose from if the pool is already being restricted? And Lisa, yes, it is Mulan. And why do we pick Mulan to go along with this particular myth? Because it really wasn't about whether Mulan was qualified or not. It was whether Mulan had the opportunity to join the army and do what she had the skills and knowledge to do. The solutions to this, or the actions to take in order to address these realities, are to be flexible. That doesn't mean lowering standards, which is always like the comeback people have for this one. But it's really asking yourself, what are your hidden biases and assumptions that are built into this opportunity? Do you expect people to have unpaid internships? Are cars required in cities without public transportation systems? What barriers are you creating in the opportunities that you're presenting, and how can you address them? What requirements exist beyond barriers for BIPOC and other historically excluded people? What practices of the nonprofit industrial complex disproportionately impact BIPOC and historically excluded people that are the requirements for these roles? Now, there was a reality to this as well that we're not going to get too much into today, because quite frankly, it's the one that's too often focused on. Yesterday, I was part of Yvette's presentation, and in Yvette's presentation, someone was talking about the fact that only 5% of mental health professionals with a particular qualification are BIPOC. It's a reality that is part of this pipeline as well. However, if you're responsible for hiring someone with that qualification to your organization, flexibility still matters. How can you hire someone and help them get that certification? Maybe you don't have the fiscal resources to give someone a full scholarship. Can you offer a partial scholarship? Can you give someone the time during their workday that they need in order to attend classes, to help connect people to mentors and sponsors, etc.? So at the end of the day, those things like qualifications and certifications and particular degrees, they might not be the full stop that we've believed them to be. Where can you look at those requirements and think, what is it that I really want? What is it that I'm really trying to, what am I really valuing with the requirements from these presentations? Could experience be a substitute for education? I worked for an organization that had one of the most brilliant nonprofit professionals I've ever worked for. And this gentleman did not have a master's degree, but he had been working in the program for over 15 years, had intimate knowledge of the community, was an incredible leader, and he had a bachelor's degree. How could we have looked at his experience and valued that as much as the experience someone would get inside of institutions that have historically excluded BIPOC and other people from their ranks? What it really comes down to so often is about opportunity and access. When we look at the evidence that there are increased education rates amongst BIPOC professionals, yet they're still being excluded from opportunities, are underemployed, or are not being given the same titles as their white peers, we have to ask ourselves, is it really about education and qualifications? I'm going to read quickly a stat that was published recently in 2019. Even workers with college degrees are more likely to be unemployed than similarly educated white workers, 3.5% versus 2.2%. When they are employed, Black workers with a college or advanced degree are more likely than their white counterparts to be underemployed when it comes to their skill level. So what does that mean? At the end of the day, we have to, one, again, think more broadly and flexibly, but we also have to make sure that the people within our own organizations are getting access to opportunities to build their experience and achieve their own professional goals, even if that means being flexible with their roles in their job title. Sometimes it requires us to move outside of the box. And lastly, a reality is that organizations need the wisdom of BIPOC leaders. BIPOC knowledge is right now, I have to say, it's becoming a bit of a commodity in the nonprofit sector, where you have folks trying to package their knowledge of the BIPOC community as a way to gain clout or to gain job opportunities. And when I say this, I'm talking about our white peers oftentimes. So if we recognize that this is an important source of knowledge and information, then we also need to credit BIPOC people for their lived experiences, knowledge, and expertise, and pay them for this knowledge. We talk about lowering requirements in order to increase the pipeline, but at the end of the day, do we consider it lowering requirements when we hire white professionals to serve BIPOC communities that they don't have an intimate knowledge or lived experience of? So when we think about these roles and when we think about who we're letting into our opportunities, it's important that we think about these three realities, not just the quote lack of BIPOC candidates.
That was great. Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that we do at the collective, we've been hiring. I take the example of making a land acknowledgement, right? And one of the things that we've been doing has been, we've been actually bringing in and hiring Indigenous folks to actually share their lived experiences and to make the land acknowledgement. And I've seen one other conference do that before. So that's just an example of one thing that you can do.
Ty, I'm going to piggyback and also just add to that. Part of what we also uplift when we try to expand our group's knowledge of Indigenous leaders is recognizing that they do so much more than just the land acknowledgements. And we recognize that they're doing so much work in other facets of the sector. So for us, it's a way to also recognize that BIPOC people are knowledgeable of things just beyond BIPOC issues as well.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about myth 2. We post our job listings everywhere, but we're still not being able to fill the positions with BIPOC folks. So that's a myth. And let's talk about why that's a myth. And if you can guess what fairy tale this is, make sure that you drop it into the chat. So myth 2, we post our job listings everywhere. Now, why is this a myth? It's a myth because oftentimes you're posting your job listings, but you're posting your job listings in places where you would normally look for job listings or in places within your own networks. So you are sharing the job listings with your own peers, which more than likely is a homogenous group. You're not really reaching out to any type of BIPOC listservs or reaching out to folks that may have access to those communities. And we see this particularly, especially when there are boards that are looking to hire CEOs and executives and really any C-suite level position. And particularly when there is a search firm that is hired, and if that search firm has the homogeneous makeup of the board, they're not going to have a diverse network of people to pull from either. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And in the evidence sheets that you received, there's an article that talks more about this, and also a book. So let's talk about the action. So what does that look like? That looks like opportunity hoarding, just spreading your job listings and the opportunities to communities that look like yours. So let's talk about the action. How can we move forward and how can we move past this? So some of the things that you can do is you can support the time and cost of outreach. Right now in the chat, how much do you spend? If you had to pull a ballpark number, how much does your organization spend on recruitment and retention? Ballpark number, just drop it in the chat. If you had to guess. No one? Okay, well, I can tell you, most organizations that I've worked for, okay, Michelle said recently spent about $2,000 to post a job. That is great, Michelle, because I can tell you the organizations that I have worked for in the past, we did not pay for the job postings. We might have paid for a premium Indeed membership, but that was about it. It was posting it on free job listings and sending out emails to our networks and also sharing it with the staff that work there and asking them to share it with their folks. John Hart said 75 to 100K. John, you are really doing some magical work then with those types of numbers, because those numbers for me are unheard of. But hey, if you're doing it, then I just want to commend you on that, because the time that it actually costs for you to, the time and the money that it actually costs for you to recruit a new employee, it costs even more for you to have to hire that employee again or another employee again if you aren't retaining them. So you want to make sure that you're putting in the time to getting the right candidate, putting in the money it takes for you to get the right candidate so they can stay within your organization and you can begin to nurture that employee-employer relationship, because it's going to save you more money on the back end. So then let's also talk about some other ways that you could be reaching out. So some other ways that you could be reaching out is not just your own networks, but also reaching out into the community, looking at professional associations that there are within the community, Do you have any professional associations that belong to your organization? I remember Boys and Girls Club, when I worked for Boys and Girls Club, they had a BIPOC group, and there were executives within that BIPOC group. And I turned to them to ask them about other opportunities that they knew of, and if they would be willing to share things with me. So these are just some out of the box ways that you can think about reaching out to more folks, broadening your horizons, broadening your reach, and posting your job listings in specific and intentional places where you are going to recruit qualified BIPOC candidates.
And as part of that too, as we're talking about these professional associations, it's also thinking about what resources are you putting towards those professional associations, and what resources are you putting towards building those relationships in the community, not just when you're recruiting and hiring people, but all the time as well. So Michelle and John, thank you for sharing the numbers that you put out there. Now I'd like people to think, how much money are you putting into professional associations for your staff members? Are you covering those costs for your staff members? Maybe you have a membership to the Center for Nonprofits. Obviously, shout out Linda's in the room. Make sure you're getting that professional association fee paid every year. But what other professional associations are you contributing to make sure that your staff members are networking and connecting beyond your community? I'd be really curious to hear if people are prioritizing that time as well. So even if maybe you're not able to cover all the costs for these kinds of associations, or having your staff members attend different opportunities, are you compensating them with their time, making sure that you're giving them those time away from the office, and making sure that when you're giving them time, it's not just, hey, I know that you have to attend the Nonprofit Professionals of Color Collective this month. That's a whole day off this Friday in order to be on in another capacity. I'm going to give you that time, but I expect you to get your 40-hour work week done in the 4 days that you're left in the office. So it's making sure that we're dedicating resources to this kind of community building fully throughout the year, not only when we need to tap into them.
And not making outside PD that does not support your organization, not making your staff use PTO in order to participate in it. Because even though it may not particularly support your organization, it's supporting your employee and it's supporting their growth. And that will be given back to you tenfold. So let's move forward to the next one. And I'm going to kick it back over to my colleague, Vicki.
I saw Allison mentioned in the chat that this fairy tale she caught was Cinderella. And I think Cinderella is a great fairy tale for that myth, because you think about this prince that was going throughout the land to find his princess, but almost overlooked the woman that was cleaning the floor, right? So it's about really thinking beyond the people that we're typically looking at, and thinking more broadly about who our community is. The next myth, myth 3, our office is welcoming of all people. And I think that goes back to some of the myths that people, or the tales that people shared earlier, that people aren't a fit for our organization, people don't want to work here, etc. It comes down to this particular situation. And yes, John, it's the Goldilocks and the Three Bears situation, because it was Goldilocks who was tasting all of the porridge and determining very subjectively what was just right for her. So to her, maybe in this nonprofit scenario, the organization is a comfortable fit that welcomes everyone, but that's a very narrow way of looking at it. We need to recognize that the reality is the culture could be toxic for BIPOC and other historically excluded communities. It is so important that organizations really reflect and assess before they start initiatives to increase their BIPOC contingents. You don't want to bring BIPOC people into your toxic environment. Clean house first, please, before you subject someone to that trauma of being a part of an organization that doesn't really want them to be there, that isn't ready for them to be there. One of the pieces of evidence that you'll see is that an article from the New York Times that Black professionals are more apprehensive right now about returning to workspaces versus their white peers. One of the contributors to that article said, "This is the first year of my professional career where someone didn't touch my hair inappropriately in a workspace without asking me first," right? To have that be a part of your office experience, to be dealing constantly with the barrage of microaggressions, some would call those macroaggressions as well, of having to perpetually reharm themselves in these spaces, it's traumatic. And the idea that being able to work from home is attractive means that for a lot of people, they don't have to deal with those kinds of workplaces. So please assess your organizations beyond your own lens. Do an organizational culture assessment. And if you recognize as part of this assessment, you should be also recognizing who is making decisions within your organization, who has power. Are there other BIPOC leaders already a part of your institution's hierarchy? Are they making decisions at the top of the organization? Are they guiding your organization's strategic planning and budgeting? If not, you have more than just a recruitment issue. And that also contributes to the environment to which you're bringing in BIPOC professionals. Next, we need to check our unconscious bias. At the end of the day, a lot of what we talk about as professionalism and cultural fit come down to really practices of white organization or white supremacy culture. That term might sound a lot of harsh to folks where they think, well, we don't have people walking around in Klan hats in the middle of our office. But what you might not realize are some of the tools of white supremacy are ingrained in our work culture and masquerade themselves as best practices or standards all the time. I really encourage you to look at the list of that's included in the references shared with you in the chat, as well as to the article that Yvette just dropped, and understand that some of the things that, I'm seeing that there's an issue with copying links in the chat, so we'll work on that, and make sure that everyone gets it. But we need to recognize that some of these things we've just brushed off as normal everyday occurrences. The overt focus on what is considered professionalism and being polished, recognizing that these things are often very subjective, very biased, and we need to address that. Sometimes this may require bringing in outside folks to help you really look at your organization's culture, and you should be compensating those people for that knowledge as well, not just picking the brains of the BIPOC people in your community to ask them how they feel about the culture your organization has created. My hands are tied. This myth comes up a lot for folks who are at that middle and direct service level within organizations. The reality is that change requires all of us to be intentional, bold, and maybe even uncomfortable to make use of our power. This is really the antithesis to white supremacy culture at work, because confrontation and boldness are not something that white supremacy culture ingrain into our working environments. And so we need to break from that culture by speaking up and speaking out. Actions like speaking up in a meeting when a BIPOC colleague says something, as opposed to, here's one of my pet peeves, ready? We're now calling these micro approvals. As opposed to saying something during a meeting, going up to that colleague afterwards and saying, hey, I'm so glad you really said that thing about how we're not diverse enough, or how we're not opening up our channels enough, or that we're hoarding power. Those are the things you should be saying inside the meeting. Don't wait to do those in private. Speak up and be bold. We also need to leverage whatever power we have. What power do you have within your office? Do you do the hiring of consultant for a particular program? Are you responsible for writing a handbook? Whatever the power that you have within your role, use that power and leverage it towards creating a more anti-racist organization. And then be transparent when others are exclusionary. Information and insights have power as well. I can't stress this enough, and I don't know why we're even still talking about this. Share the salary in the job description. That is information. That is power. If you're posting a job, you have that power to share the salary and make it a more equitable and accessible process for more people.
Yes, Vicky. And you know how I feel about that, sharing that salary. Don't waste my time applying for a job if it's not even something that I would typically apply for. All right. Our last myth that we're going to be talking about today is, well, I'm an ally. I get it. I've done the work. That's myth 5, right? I've often been quoted as saying, I don't need allies. I don't need allies. I don't need friends. I don't need that. I need accomplices. I need people that are on the front lines doing the work with me, blowing shit up. Yes, I cuss because you bring your whole ass self when you're here at a collective session. I need people that are going to be doing the work with me on the front lines, boots on the ground, and not afraid. I need people that are going to be active in this fight and not being silent allies. And so what does that look like? What does an accomplice and what does an accomplice versus like allyship kind of look like? If anybody wants to chime in, please put it in the chat. In what ways have you shown up as an accomplice as opposed to being an ally, the way that I just described it just now? And so when I'm thinking about an accomplice as opposed to an ally, of course, what Vicky said earlier today in terms of speaking up in the room, get uncomfortable, have those uncomfortable conversations, not giving in and giving micro approvals, all of those things, yes. But also someone who is speaking up for you in the rooms that you're not even in. Someone who is having or stopping, negative water cooler conversation, when it comes up about you, particularly because maybe you're not a right cultural fit, but it has nothing to do with your competency or the work, like speaking to the truths of the matter for you, even when you're not there. And then also on the positive side, when opportunities are coming up, someone who is going to speak up for you and sponsor you, someone who's going to be your champion. We need people to sponsor BIPOC professionals as well as stakeholders. And we need those folks to be mixed. Randall Pinkett talks about in his book, he talks about, and this is Black Faces in White Places, is the book, it's in your reference list, but he talks about people with mixed groups of mentors being way more successful than those with homogenous mentors. So what does that mean? It means that the people who are within our community, yes, they can help us. Yes, they can, speak up for us. Yes, they can create and generate other opportunities for us. But we need our accomplices and we need our white and white presenting allies, if you will, to do that too. It can't just be on our own community to help us or to lift us up, because I am a cheerleader, okay? If I like you and the work that you're doing, I don't care if you're red, black, purple, green, or blue. I'm going to say, oh, Linda's amazing. Have you signed up for this? Oh, Miss Diallo is the bomb. Paulina is this. Like, I am that type of person, and everyone is not like that. Everyone is not vocal. So that is where being an accomplice comes in, where you have to step outside of your comfort zone and you have to get uncomfortable and you have to do things that you would not necessarily do. And if you can't do that, it's a difficult place for me to then look at you and say you're my ally. And that's just me being honest, and that's just me speaking my truth. And then another thing that we want to make sure that you're doing is continuously engaging in anti-racism and inclusion training. It cannot be one-offs. It cannot be one session and, oh, now we're fixed. Now we've done it. We've done the work, right? Or we've attended this session and now we can go out and, we can be better accomplices. No, you have to continuously do the work. When, new articles come out, are you reading them? Are you sharing them? Are you reading the books? And not just the books that are written by your white peers and your white professionals. Read the books. There are some really great books that are written by BIPOC professionals that have been in this field doing this work way longer than their white counterparts, but they're not necessarily credited with the credit that they should be given for the work that they've done in this field. And that is our last myth. And so I'm going to kick it back over to Vicki to talk about the realities, and then we're going to open things up a little bit.
So here are the real realities. Opportunity and access are the real issue, not just education. That opportunity hoarding keeps circles tight, put resources into relationship building. Culture could be toxic for excluded. I'm struggling with my words today. Sorry there, folks. Culture can be toxic for historically excluded communities. Evaluate, organization, and reflect. Change requires you to be intentional, bold, and maybe even uncomfortable to use your power. And I appreciate that Evelyn said in the chat, being an accomplice is really hard. Yes, being a BIPOC person can be really hard in different spaces too. So as an ally, and I see Evelyn shaking her head in agreement, yes, being an ally requires you to recognize that this discomfort is much less than the discomfort that BIPOC folks have to work in and walk through every day. And it's a discomfort that they don't have the choice to take on or take off. So I appreciate that being an accomplice is hard, but necessary. I also want to uplift some of the other comments. There have been some really great comments shared. And I want to just go over to the first one that I saw that popped up. Give me 1 second. Okay. Matt mentioned, thank you for acknowledging the reality that some businesses and organizations often hire BIPOC individuals to appear diverse and reach hiring quotas. The reality is that many of us, quote, diversity hires, unquote, are subjected to environments and cultures. Sorry, struggling a little bit with the chat. Are subjected to environments and cultures that do not care about who we are and rather that and what we bring to the table in terms of labor or profit. I was a diversity hire, and to this day, I am haunted by my experience there. I'm really sorry, Matt, about the experience that you had, and I'm more sorry that this is not a unique experience that I'm hearing. Many other people have shared similar ones about working in the nonprofit sector. Lisa also mentioned the idea of white racial norms is the most helpful phrase I learned this year. And yes, that's a great stand-in for white organizational culture, white racial norms. Orville mentioned, shout out Orville, hey, so important to realize that many decision-making tables were designed to accommodate white leaders first, and thus BIPOC leaders must accommodate and fit themselves into it. So it is about reconstructing the leadership table with BIPOC leaders, not just leaving a chair open. Yes, and that's why it's so important that power is shifted and not centralized within just our white leaders and white peers. Yvette mentioned, understand that the many BIPOC going to work can not only be harmful, but traumatic. When asking people of color to participate, we are putting them in roles that do not hold true power, or hiring them to put on your website to demonstrate diversity. So I really appreciate all these different thoughts that people are bringing to the table, and we'd like to open it up a little bit more to invite you to reflect. One more comment though that I want to share with everyone. Tim says, There's a Will Rogers quote: "When someone else blows your horn, the sound travels twice as far, sponsoring, rebroadcasting, and boosting the signal of BIPOC colleagues." Yes, thank you. So with that, I would like
we love you.
I would like to open up the floor and allow folks to reflect, not only on what we shared today, but are there any other lingering myths that you've heard as we talk about the BIPOC pipeline? Are there any questions that you have right now, or any thoughts that you'd like to uplift or bring to the table?
Vicki, this is Yvette. One of the things I think we do also need to acknowledge is that all of us have been raised in this white supremacist society where white is right. So therefore, just because we hire someone or bring someone in that is of color, to understand that we too, I happen to be a woman of color, that we too also have been grown in a system where we have taken on the mantle of whiteness and white supremacy. So this is not just you bring a brown person in and say, oh, they know everything about brown people and anti-white supremacy. The fact of the matter is that the work is done across the system, not just for white folks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Yvette. We did a program a few years ago here at the Institute called Recognizing and Dismantling White Organizational Culture. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was this perception that white organizational culture is just exemplified in predominantly white institutions. The idea is, though, that, as Yvette said, we've all been conditioned in this society and have to do some unlearning of our own. Orville said, one myth I've heard is it is impossible to ever break down the barriers POC still face in light of the state of our political affairs. It is pointless to try. Well, thank you for sharing that myth. And I've definitely heard that one as well. I like to point to the quote by Mother Teresa, to build anyway. That we all need to do whatever steps we can take. And because if none of us make any steps towards making that big systematic change, then that big systematic change will never come. I also saw that Tyneisha included in the chat the job plugs. They are located in New York City, but they have some roots in New Jersey as well.
All right, so we've been having some really great conversation. And so what we want to do is to give you an opportunity to continue that conversation amongst yourselves. So we're going to break you out into breakout groups, and we want you to kind of reflect. We want you to talk about, where can we be as a sector? We want you to talk about some of the other myths that you heard, some solutions, and just really reflect about your experience here. Share any experiences with each other that you've experienced. So I know we had a colleague in the chat, I think his last name was Mato, who shared about his experience and how traumatic it was. And not saying you have to rehash that or relive that, but if you wanted to share in the breakout group, if anyone wants to share, please do so. And any positive things that you're doing within your organization, any best practices that you're doing within your organization, share it here with your colleagues. And so can we also drop into the chat the Mentimeter? If you pick up your phone right now and scan this code, this QR code, it will open up a Mentimeter. I don't want you to write now what you're going to pledge to do. I want you to do that after you're talking within your groups. So when we come back from the groups, it'll be populated and we will share out what everyone says they pledge to do moving forward. Is there anything that I can clarify for you in terms of the directions of this activity? No? Okay, then Paulina, can you please open up the breakout groups?
Familiar.
All right, so thank you all for taking that time in the breakouts. Let's talk about where we can be as a sector. Let's talk about actually claiming it. I don't know. There we go. Let's talk about claiming it. It's like moving on its own. All right, so let's talk about where we can be as a sector, where we want to move to. Let's claim it. And I am going to stop here and open up the Mentimeter so that we can share what you all have pledged to do in the chat. And we want to give you an opportunity, if there's someone who, you know, wants to come off of mute and actually share their pledge, please do so. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of great ones here. Schedule our workplace inclusion satisfaction survey for the year. We did one last year and learned a lot about org culture, need to repeat annually. Yes, that's a really great one. We've had 13 people fill this out. We have 22 people on the call. So I'd like to have 100% participation. All right, so I pledge to work towards creating more equitable practices in terms of BIPOC hiring and creating a standard that workplaces must create environments dedicated towards awareness and acceptance of BIPOC individuals. Awesome. You know what? You don't have to do that from scratch, right? So reach out to us. We're going to give you our contact information, and we have resources that we know of. And there are people who have already created guidebooks and and like tips and best practices for doing just that. So you can try some things on it and see what works for your organization, and whatever doesn't work, throw it out. All right, follow it up on an email regarding social justice matters and engage in foundation support. Request that our organization include a DEI assessment and plan ASAP. I pledge to be happy. Yes, that matters. Self-care matters. Devote time to updating my reading list of books and addressing structural racism. Absolutely. Follow up with Tyneisha. All right. I'm going to stop share here. Thank you. And keep these coming if you're still thinking about what you're going to do. And don't forget to reach out to us for that support. I'm going to share my screen again so that my colleague Vicky can take us home.
At the end of the day, everything that you shared here today is about how can we take physical steps. We know that the idea of addressing diversity in our workplaces can be overwhelming and daunting to all of us, right, who are a part of this system. And so we really want to encourage you to think about actions. What is a physical thing that I can do? And before I wrap everything up, there are two things I want to address. First, if you didn't guess it, the last myth was the emperor's new clothes, because here you have this person who's saying they're an ally, but at the end of the day, they were just a cute little naked baby. And then also want to just bring to light a comment that Keith brought up that I think was so valuable that we didn't really get to address. Keith mentioned that as he was talking about hiring someone, he heard things like, I've heard mixed things about that person. And what I'd like us all to do is when we hear those kinds of comments and feedback, or when we see maybe that a BIPOC person has switched organizations, right? Recognizing the fact that they're dealing with those systems of inequity and these structures that do not serve them. And so let's not penalize BIPOC people for leaving an organization that was potentially traumatic and harmful. That doesn't mean that every BIPOC person has left an organization for that reason, but let's also recognize that that's a possible reason why someone was not able to thrive and succeed within a space, or who did thrive and succeed within a space, but at the detriment to their own mental health and well-being. So thanks for bringing that up, Keith. It's a valuable point.
And I just want to just chime in. It's not only possible, but just be cognizant of the fact that that is also very hard to articulate, and also very hard to navigate what you share and what you don't share, because, you know, like many folks, I was always taught, you know, you don't ED bash, you know, and so you never want to be in that position. And so that's a minefield that BIPOC professionals who have experienced that have to navigate. And that's very hard to be able to articulate or put into words or explain when you are in an interview process.
Mm-hmm. So ultimately today, we reinforce the idea, I hope, that there are no magic beans in this work, right? There's no magic solution or portal that's going to bring in all the BIPOC professionals to your organization. There's real work that needs to be done, and there are actual actions that we can be taking. Is it signing up for professional development associations for your staff? Is it having conversations with your staff individually about what their goals and aspirations are, and then creating actual avenues for helping them to achieve those goals? Is it thinking more flexibly about how we define our opportunities and the requirements for those opportunities, thinking more about what's more important, what's the values that I'm trying to convey with this opportunity, as opposed to adhering to the kinds of requirements that just reinforce white supremacy culture. I hope that today you've taken away some of those lessons and some of those actions that you'll think about moving forward. Again, we're always a resource here for you. And we wish you the best of luck on this journey. Tyneisha, can you just share our contact information? We'd love to connect with you. Outside of today's session, you can find all of our information on the bio page, and we'll also make sure to share our contact info in the chat. So thank you all for joining us. We are exactly on time, kind of. We're like a minute over, but yay! So thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of the conference.